Hello everybody and welcome to this session of Birding 101. So for this online recording, I'm going to be covering bird migration. I'm going to be giving you an introduction to why birds migrate, how they do it, and then give you some pointers on birds to look out for as we go into the spring. My name's Kate and I'm a youth rep for the British Trust for Ornithology. I'm also a training officer for the organisation, for the BTO. And yes, I'm really looking forward to going through this session with you. So today we're going to be talking about what is migration, why, when and how do birds migrate. We're going to talk a bit about monitoring migration, what to look out for, migration and us. And then I've got a few challenges for you if you'd like to go on and develop your skills further. So what is migration? Let's have a think about what migration is. Now, if you want to, feel free to pause the video and have a think yourself. What different definitions have you heard, or what would you think of when someone says the word migration? So this is the definition that ornithologists use, so people who study birds. So migration is bird movements occurring at predictable times of year between breeding and one or more non-breeding areas, and therefore involving flights in a predictable direction. So the main thing here is that it's predictable. So we'll talk a little bit more later on about when you can expect birds to be migrating and in which directions, but that's the main thing. They do these repeated movements and they do them the same more or less each time. Okay. So I've got some amazing examples for you now because there's a whole spectrum of migration through the animal kingdom, and birds are just one example. But even within birds, there are so many amazing feats that birds do that I think people don't quite often realize how amazing it is. And when you start actually thinking about it, it's just absolutely mind-blowing. So the first example I've got for you is the bar-tailed godwit. Now, this is the record holder for the longest non-stop migration. So believe it or not, these birds that are probably about this big travel 11,000 kilometers non-stop over the Pacific Ocean. So to put that into scale, here's a map for you. So they travel from up here in Alaska non-stop 11,000 kilometers down to New Zealand. And the record, the fastest time in which a bird had done this is eight days. And that averaged at about 56 kilometers per hour, which is amazing. For one bird to do that, I get tired sometimes when I walk up the stairs. So that's quite an achievement in order to do that. And there's a lot of adaptations that they need to do in order to be able to do this, which I'll talk a little bit more about later on. Another amazing example is the Arctic tern. Now, this is a species that we do have in the UK. We also have bar-tailed godwits in the UK, but with bar-tailed godwits, that's a different population, the Alaska population, the Pacific population, to the ones that we have here. So these Arctic terns, our very own Arctic terns, travel up to 95,000 kilometers. Now, this is the longest ever recorded migration. It's not in one go, so they do stop off. But the fact that they can do this, they literally go from the Arctic to Antarctica and back. So this is a map. So they'll start off in their breeding areas. So say they're coming, I think this map shows them coming from Iceland and Greenland, but we also have them in the UK, for example, on the Farne Islands or up in the north of the UK. They have a little fuel stop on the way back, but on the way down, they kind of do this figure of eight. So they either go down along the west coast of Africa and then keep hugging the coast of Africa to get to their wintering grounds, or some of them cross over the Atlantic to the coast of South America, and then they winter down here in Antarctica, and then they all seem to go up in this kind of S-shaped pattern, have a little fuel stop on the way, and then go back to their breeding grounds. Now that is they are literally not quite circumnavigating the world, but yeah, they're going from end to end, and they just have an endless summer if you think about it, because that's what they're doing. They're having a summer in the north, and then they're going down and they're having a summer in the south. Another example is the bar-headed goose. Now this is a species that you will find in Asia, and they fly over the Himalayas. So over the tallest mountain range in the world, so they go from India to Mongolia, and that in order to be able to do that, that is so high that they then need to be able to adapt to things, for example, like a lower level of oxygen in the air. Because as you go higher up, you may have seen people, climbers who climb to the top of Mount Everest, they have to train themselves to be able to deal with that lower level of oxygen. And they're having to do that while flying. So they're doing a lot of energy with very little oxygen. The air pressure is also very different. So they have a lot of adaptations to be able to do this. We also have another example of another UK bird, and this one it's one of my favorites. And when you think about it like this, it just makes them that more amazing. It is the goldcrest. Now, they're our smallest bird, along with the firecrest, weighing only 5 grams. So that's about the same as a 2p piece. And they cross the North Sea. So they will, we do have some resident birds, so some birds that stay in the UK all year round, but some birds in the autumn will come over from Scandinavia on the continent and they will cross the North Sea and come onto the East Coast. And sometimes you'll see them on the East Coast in autumn, just absolutely exhausted after that journey. And when people used to see these goldcrests arriving in the autumn, they couldn't comprehend that these birds were actually flying across the North Sea. How could a bird that small fly that far? Well, obviously, the only reasonable explanation is that they got on the back of woodcocks. So as you can see, this bird down here at the bottom, this is a woodcock. They're a very interesting wader that lives in our woodlands. But again, they're another species that in the autumn, they'll migrate over. They tend to do it on full moons. So then you may hear the term woodcock moons. And because the timings of arrival coincided with the woodcock arriving and the goldcrests arriving, people put two and two together, and that's what they thought. Now, they don't actually go on the back of woodcocks, they do power themselves, but it's just a nice little bit of folklore that yeah, makes it that bit more interesting. It's not just birds that migrate either. So a lot of different animals migrate, including fish. Now, this is an awesome example from the UK that I think a lot of people don't even think about. It's the European eel. Now, they're actually critically endangered. We've absolutely lost a massive proportion of our eels in recent years. So they spend most of their time developing in the Sargasso Sea, and then they migrate into the North Sea, where they mature. And then they come into our rivers, and they then mature in our rivers. So you'll also see them inland. And then once they've when they come into they come to the UK to breed and spend that adult life stage, and then they'll it's an amazing migration that they do, and it's still not fully understood. And people do actually fish these. You may hear people fishing glass eels and also the adult eels themselves. So for example, jellied eels. But yeah, they undertake this amazing migration. However, it's thought that less than 1 in 500 of the larvae, so of those young eels, actually survive that journey. And that is because of a lot of threats. So for example, there's predators, but we're also actually putting barriers in the way of them. So for example, as you can you may have seen like weirs where when there's mills and there's barriers in the way. So either there could be a dam or there could be a weir where there's really fast flowing water, and that then creates an artificial barrier from these kind of ancestral routes that they would have taken. So some environmental organisations and councils have actually been trying to combat this and come up with some more fish-friendly and migration-friendly waterways. So, for example, here you can see an installation that's kind of helped. It enables the fish to be able to work their way up here rather than, for example, there being a dam or something else in the way. So they can actually get back and get to those routes and get to the grounds that they need to. It also happens under our noses and also above our heads. So you may also have heard of some insects and some very, very beautiful insects as well that migrate. So a classic example is the painted lady. This is a butterfly that we have in the UK in summer. And another animal is the marmalade hoverfly, and moths as well do it. So silverwire. Now, these are all examples of animals that do a multi-generational migration. So, multi-generational migration. So they breed but they don't just do it in one go. They don't just do the whole journey in one go like birds do. They'll do a step, so maybe go a few hundred miles, and then they'll reproduce. Their offspring will then continue that journey, they'll reproduce, and essentially it's a staggered migration where different generations will go, and each one will get further and further north, and then eventually they'll come further and further south. And that's amazing because the journeys that they travel, and they're quite high up in the sky as well. And they also pick favorable winds. So they've even found that, for example, marmalade hoverflies, they position their bodies with the winds to be able to kind of help the way that they're going and make sure that they're going in the right direction and use that to their benefit. And if it's not favorable winds, then sometimes they just do not fly. And that is amazing that they're able to do that, be able to determine that and even know where they're going. So we've spoken a bit about some examples. Now we're going to think about, why do birds migrate? So migration is very costly, and I don't mean that it's actually costing them money. It costs them energy, it costs them time. It means that, for example, if you had a territory in the summer, if you leave that territory, it's like when you sit on a chair and you don't want anyone else getting that chair because it's in a really good spot. You don't really want to be leaving that because by the time you come back, someone will have taken it. So there are many reasons why it's costly. So why would they even bother? It must be beneficial in order for something to evolve. So the main reasons they do it, in short, is to take advantage of favorable conditions. So that could be weather, that could be light levels, that could be the number of predators, but also, and almost most importantly, food as well. You need to have food where you are. So they do this in order to maximize get the best conditions that they can. The UK, we're really, really well situated for migrant birds. So that's why we get such amazing spectacles, and also why we get such good numbers of birds at certain times of year. So for example, in the winter, we get an influx of wintering birds. So we'll get birds, thrushes such as redwing and fieldfare. We'll get finches come across, such as siskin and redpoll. But we also get an amazing number of wildfowl, so ducks, geese, and swans, and waders, and that's because of how we are situated. So it's all about location, location, location. So I've drawn a line here of our latitude, so that's how far north we are. And if we have a think about other places at that same latitude and what the conditions would be like there in winter, in the winter, it can get a bit chilly, but generally it's quite mild here in the UK. Now, if you compare that to other places at the same latitude, for example, Canada, it is very, very chilly. And I once had a supervisor on a job who said to people that if you went over to Canada, you might come face to face with a polar bear. Now, that might be exaggerating slightly, but it just puts it into perspective how cold it is in other areas. So essentially, birds that are coming here in winter can get those favorable weather conditions. It can be that bit warmer. If you rely on water to be able to feed and to be able to live on, you don't want that water to be frozen. So it means that it's milder. And by coming to the UK as opposed to going all the way like much further south in Europe or even to Africa, that means that you can benefit from those conditions without having to fly as far. So the reason for this is the Gulf Stream. So as we can see here, we're getting very, very warm winds, very kind of warm weather coming all across the Atlantic to us, and this is why we have very mild winters. It's generally why we have quite a mild climate kind of altogether. This is kind of helping to regulate that. And that's why, compared to other places, it's much milder. We are on that front, so we are getting that nice weather, nice warm. And also for those wetland birds as well, we have an amazing suite of wetlands. Being on the coast, we have a lot of estuaries. We also have a lot of inland wetlands, so wet meadows, moorland. So there is a lot of habitat there for them to use, so they are able to do that. It's not just about the wintering birds though, so as I'm recording this, I'm going into spring, and birds also migrate to go to their breeding grounds as well as their wintering grounds. So generally in spring, birds head north, and they can They do that because they can benefit from longer days, less competition, which means that there's more feeding and lower predation. So as you go further north in the summer, you have longer days, which means that you can be foraging for longer as well. Because particularly if this is for birds that are diurnal, which means that they are active during the day. If there's less competition as well, that also means that you can feed more. And finally, lower predation. There's a general rule of thumb that the further north you go, the fewer predators there are. Now, this is kind of more, there's more on the, if you think of it globally, so in the tropics, there's a lot more, and around the equator, there's a lot more predators than as you get further north into the Arctic. For example, ground predators, there's probably mainly polar bears and Arctic foxes, whereas even here, we've got a lot more than that. We've got small mammals, we've got a lot of mustelids, so like stoats, weasels, badgers, otters. So there's a lot more here, but compared to further south, it's low. So that's good. And that means that you're less likely to get eaten, which is always a good thing. Now let's have a think about when birds migrate. So the main peak of bird migration is spring and autumn. Evidence does show that birds are migrating in one form or another all year round, but the main peaks are in spring and autumn. So depending on when you're watching this, hopefully it is a great time for you to get out and go bird watching. So you may also hear bird watchers use the term vismig, and essentially that means visible migration. So if you go out at these peak migration times, you may be lucky enough to see migration in action. So quite often that means going out and situating yourself, for example, on a hill or on a peninsula where there's a funnel. So, for example, in the autumn, last autumn I was at Spurn Bird Observatory, and that is on the Yorkshire coast, and it is just an absolute funneling birds around the side of the Humber estuary. And you would just have them going south, like right past you, because they were just getting funneled down that little strip of land. So it can be an amazing thing to watch, and I definitely recommend trying to get out. A few people as well, people that are really into kind of the timings of things, the more you get out bird watching, the more you'll notice patterns. And some people will have a particular bird that will herald the start of a particular season. So for example, it might be seeing your first swallow, hearing your first cuckoo, hearing your first chiff-chaff singing, just as some examples for spring. But I know some people that, in terms of autumn, say that, for example, autumn migration starts when they see their first green sandpiper. So this is the reserve wardens at WWT Slimbridge. They say that autumn starts on Green Sandpiper Day, when their first green sandpiper turns up. And when I was there, that was in July, so it does somewhat make the summer feel quite short. But yes, birds are migrating at different times of year. And in the case of waders, quite often, you'll also notice that different bird species, you'll notice patterns even in things such as the age of those birds. So you may notice that earlier in the migration season, you see that it's more adults, and then later on you get more juveniles, or it might be more females, and then it goes to males and juveniles. And that's because the females will have the eggs and they'll start raising the chicks, and then as soon as they can, when they're kind of self-sufficient enough, they'll clear off. Males will clear off as well. And then the young obviously don't quite have all the reserves and all the energy and the muscle that they need, so they may take a bit longer. So that's why they can be a bit later. So there's interesting things like that you can look out for. You also may hear the term knockmig, and that means nocturnal migration. So this is when birds migrate at night, and a lot of birds do migrate at night. And actually, if you go out at night during these migration times, you might even hear them. And an amazing example is during the 2020 coronavirus lockdown. Obviously, there was a lot less traffic, so things were a lot quieter. People also had a bit more time, and they were, for example, sitting out in their gardens. And between the 1st and the 4th of April 2020, all of these pins on this map represent records of common scoter where people heard them from their gardens at night. Now, common scoter are a sea duck, so normally you'd expect to see them only around the coast. In the day, they're very, very rare to see inland unless, for example, there's been a storm. Now, why were they hearing them then? Well, what it was is that they were heading north to their breeding grounds, but rather than go all the way around the coast, which would take a very long time, they were just taking a shortcut and going right across the UK. So even people in the Midlands were hearing them. And it's just an example of how, yeah, you don't always expect it, but sometimes it does reveal some brilliant things. And a lot of people will put out these recorders, for example, on their roof, and in the morning, they'll get up and they'll check and they'll look through and they'll record what's gone over, because quite often you wouldn't have a clue what was actually going over unless you did that. So it's a really fun thing you can get involved in. Field guides can also be really, really helpful for giving you an idea of what to expect at different times of year. So they can also help you identify similar looking species. So here I have the key to the maps from my first bird guide. So this is my first bird guide here. But a lot of field guides will have these maps in and these little keys, so they can be really useful if you have one. And I've got an example here for you to see how you can use this in practice. So for example, here we have the Wimbrel and the Curlew. Now these are very, very similar waders. One's slightly smaller than the other, so the Wimbrel is ever so slightly smaller. And you may hear people talking about differences, like the Wimbrel has a strong markings on its head and its beak's a bit shorter, less curved. But essentially, if you see one of these out on an estuary and there's a lot of heat haze, it's really far away, you might struggle to tell the difference because they are so similar. However, there are some clues that you can use to help you distinguish this straight away. And one of those is the time of year and where they are. So imagine that you saw this bird inland in summer. Who is it? So here's some maps and here's the code. Here's the key for the maps. So green is resident, yellow is summer, pinky red is passage, and blue is winter. And if there's white, that means that the bird isn't recorded there. So I'll just give you a moment to think. Feel free to pause the video if you want to. So hopefully from that, you got that this bird is much more likely to be a curlew. So as we can see on the Wimbrel, it's only during passage, so that's going to be the spring and the autumn, that the bird's seen. And even then, it's mainly in coastal areas, or it doesn't venture too far inland. Whereas if we look at the curlew, inland, there's so the yellow, you can see it's summer. It tends to only be inland in the summer. Although in these areas in the Midlands, that's where they're resident all year round. So you're much more likely to have seen a curlew in that instance. So that just shows how it can help you identify those species. Now we're going to think about how birds migrate, because it's an absolutely amazing feat. How do they even go about doing it? Well, there's quite a few adaptations that they have that enable them to do this. So they increase feeding to put on fat, and this is known as hyperphagy. So it means they're eating a lot more. Phagy means to eat, hyper means increase, so increase feeding. And yeah, many of them can put on a lot of weight. Some species don't bother. For example, swift swallows, other hirundines, they can feed on the way, so they're fine. They don't need to bother. But some species, for example, the garden warbler, or the pale-bellied Brent goose. The pale-bellied Brent goose has to fly over a lot of land. Sorry, not land, a lot of sea, because pale-bellied Brents, they go to Iceland and then they go and breed in Greenland. So there's a lot of sea between those areas. They can't feed. So what they have to do is feed before they go. Many of them can actually add 10% of their body weight every single day. So, for example, a garden warbler doubles its body mass in a few weeks. And pale-bellied Brent geese, as I said, need to fuel their journey because when they get to Greenland, they get there before there's like the green up, before the grass and their food actually starts to grow, because it'll been just before the snow and the ice retreats, just after the snow and the ice retreats. So that means that they have to feed up and they have to have all of the resources in them to be able to go and breed, make eggs if you're a female, sit on the eggs, and that will see them through until the chicks then hatch, and then there will eventually be the grass or whatever it is they're feeding on. So it has to see them through a long way. So they have to feed a lot. They also, many of them also shrink their unnecessary organs. So this is the leg muscles, for example, or their digestive tract. If you're not walking and you're not eating, you do not need those. So if you shrink them, that means there's less weight for you to have to kind of carry all that way. And also it kind of means that those other muscles more can be invested in those other areas of your body. So for example, the pectoral muscles, which are the muscles in their chest that power the flight, they will then increase. They also get migratory restlessness. So this is when they start to get well, restless, as that suggests. And there is a German word for it as well. So this is a thing that birds experience. And I've even seen this myself at WWT Slimbridge. In the winter, they get Russian white-fronted geese. And when it gets to kind of the end of the winter, when they're starting to think about migrating, you'll see them just kind of getting a little bit funny, and they're not feeding as much. They're just kind of standing around a bit agitated. And they'll also do these practice flights where they will all, a few of them will go up and they'll just fly around, and it's almost as if they're kind of checking that, oh, if I go, are you going to go with me? Also, I guess exercising those muscles. So yeah, they get quite restless when they're about to go. They do show signs of this. And then once they actually start, they're going to be flying for days at a time. So all of these adaptations enable them to be able to do this amazing, kind of physically demanding and physiologically demanding activity. So yes, it's insane. How do they actually know where they're going then? How do they navigate? Well, there's a few theories and with evidence supporting each of them for how different birds migrate and how they can tell where they're going. So some of them will learn from others. For example, Buick swans and similarly hooper swans and the geese as well, the migratory geese that we have, they will migrate as a family unit when the young in their first winter. So those cygnets will go with their parents and they will learn the routes. They will learn where the good wintering grounds are and the good places to stop off on the way. And it's thought that that will then teach them because they will then keep coming back to those places. So that's how you can, that's one way to do it. However, some of them go it alone. So there's quite a few that go to similar places and do meet their parents. So their parents, I don't know if the parents are somehow telling them, but I don't see how they could. But for example, the cuckoo never even meets its parents because the parent will lay the egg, it will then leave, and it's long gone back to Africa by the time the chick actually starts migrating. So how does it know where to go? Well, there's several theories. So people think that it's related to the genetics. So it's innate. It means that it is in you, it's in your genes, and you just know how to do it. So yeah, it's thought that it's controlled by genetics. Also landmarks as well. So birds might be flying along and they might follow landmarks. For example, rivers can help guide them, and you'll sometimes see birds following kind of waymarks like that. Celestial clues. Now, this isn't anything to do with aliens. This is stars and the moon, essentially clues in the sky. It can even be the sun as well. So where is the sun in relation to the bird? Because as we know, the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. So they know that and they can use that information to their advantage. For example, Manx shearwaters, quite often the chicks before they fledge, these are a seabird that nest on islands around the UK, and they do this amazing migration from their islands in the UK and in Europe all the way down to South America and back. And this is the longest living UK bird. So the oldest record was on Bardsey Island of a bird that lived for, I think, 51 years and 11 months at least. And it was caught as an adult and then refound as an adult. So I don't know if that bird's still around now, but it's a long time, and a lot of times, 51 times, well, yeah, at least 51 times to do that migration to South America and back. And they think that they use the stars before the chicks fledge. Once the parents have gone, they'll just go and kind of sit outside their burrow and start flapping their wings to exercise their muscles. And they think they just look up at the sky and just learn what the map is like of the sky where they're from, and then they know to come back and find that, which is amazing. They also think that they can use smell, so that's the olfactory senses, and particularly birds such as Manx shearwaters, they're called tube noses, related to the fulmar, even related to the albatross. They have an amazing sense of smell, so they think that they can even find their burrows by using smell. And finally, the magnetic field as well. So it's thought that birds can detect the magnetic field and use that to work out where they are on the globe. So they learn the magnetic field where they were born, and then they'll return to that place. So it might even be, it's either they can sense it in their head, but it's even thought that they might be able to see the magnetic field. So there's these, it's called cryptochrome molecules in their eyes, which essentially can see the magnetic field as they're looking around, which is a whole, we can't even comprehend that. We can't imagine what that would see, that would look like, which is, yeah, they're cool. So as birds are very finely tuned to all of these cues, unfortunately climate change seems to be affecting them, which is really, really sad. One thing that it's affecting is the phenology. Now, this means the timing of biological events. So things, for example, when the bird starts to sing, when it needs to mate, when it needs to molt, when it needs to change its feathers, and also when it needs to migrate as well. So it's essentially nature's calendar. Synchronization is key because in nature, things are dependent on each other. So you need to be synchronized with other animals. You need to be synchronized with other birds of the same species. For example, when you're mating and when you're breeding, you need to be breeding at the same time so that kind of, for example, if the males arrive first, you need the females to then arrive soon after so that they're there together and they can breed. But also other species, for example, prey, if you want your food to be around, because otherwise you haven't got anything to eat. So things like that. So as I say, yes, they need to have babies when food is around, because if you mistime that, then you can't feed your babies as much, so you might not have as many babies, and then that's not very good. So birds use very different cues to know when they need to start migrate, as we've seen. But an example is also temperature and weather conditions. So they are thought to give cues to birds as to when they need to migrate. So climate change can severely impact the birds' phenology in this sense. So climate change can alter these clues, so it can alter the temperature that is experienced and when that temperature is experienced, and also what type of weather you get at that time of year. Birds then change their arrival time, but that might mean that they then mismatch with the resources, particularly if birds are coming from a long way away. The weather, if it's temperature and weather, the weather and temperature where they are might be changing differently to the weather and temperature here. So that just creates a whole mess of well, a whole range of possibilities of how things could go wrong. So this has caused a lot of birds to decline. So for example, in Iceland, a lot of shorebirds, so waders, have declined, and it's thought this is the reason why. So for example, the red knot, they're a wader that we get here, and they go up and breed in Iceland. They've collapsed, and it's thought that it's because glacial melt has reduced snow cover, and this collapses small mammal cycles because it means that the mammals aren't available for predators, so they then turn to the knot to feed them, like to feed themselves. So they eat the knot, so the knot are declining because the mammals are declining because of climate change. So it's not good. And as we can see from this graph here, it is also affecting when birds are arriving in the UK. So this graph shows the historical average in red of chiffchaff kind of abundance and when they're recorded. So this is the number kind of percentage of complete lists. So say the number of complete lists in the UK. This is bird records to bird track, which is our recording, one of our surveys that I'll talk a bit more about later, how many of those records that were submitted had chiffchaff in. And as we can see, as I said, the historical average is in red. The Beast of the East year is that was 2017, I think. Essentially, as you can see from this map, different years can have different trends because the birds are arriving at different times because the weather's different. So in a normal spring, this purple one, 2017, it was warmer, so chiffchaffs arrived about 7 days earlier than normal, which is the red. Whereas in the Beast of the East in 2018, they arrived much later, so in green, they were much later. So therefore, there's kind of 2 to 3 weeks difference between the first arrival of chiffchaffs between 2017 and 2018. That's only between a year, and that's 2 to 3 weeks difference. That's amazing, and how scary how quickly that can happen. Now that might not necessarily last for ages. That might be that year on year they're just going to be a lot more variable. But it's interesting that that's something we can look into. Another example of phenological mismatch is the pied flycatcher. So their timing of migration is driven by photoperiod. So it's not affected by the temperature or the weather. It's the amount of light that there is in a day. And that means that that's going to be consistent. That's going to be the same every single year. So you'd expect them to keep migrating the same every single year, because even when they're in their in their wintering grounds in Africa, the photoperiod will change the same every single year, which means it's not affected by the climate. However, the oak budburst and the caterpillars which feed on the oak leaves, which the pied flycatchers then feed on, are getting much, much earlier. So here we can see kind of the 1970s date, and the fact that they are getting much, much earlier. However, the pied flycatchers aren't getting that much earlier. So that they're not advancing, they're not arriving earlier. So by the time they've actually arrived, the number of caterpillars are decreasing because they've had their peak. Also, other birds, for example, blue tits, great tits, they've been eating them as well, because there's obviously other animals in that ecosystem that are relying on the same resources. So that means that by the time the pied flycatchers get there, there is not as many resources for them to be able to feed their young. So that's going to have knock-on impacts. However, it's not bad news for all species. So I've got an example of good news story here, depending on how you look at it. So some species do actually benefit from warmer weather. So for example, black-tailed godwits, which are a species that we get in the UK, we get two, they're called races of black-tailed godwits. So their Latin name is Lamosa lamosa. And you have Lamosa lamosa lamosa, which are the European ones, the ones that breed in kind of mainland Europe, and in a few places in the UK, but they're massively declining. And then you have Lamosa lamosa icelandica, which are the ones which go to Iceland. Now, the Icelandic population has actually increased by 10 times, which has been thought to be due to climate change, because there's more vegetation, which means that there's more nests, and also it's warmer, so they are using less energy. So that's meant that the population has increased. We're also seeing a change in what birds we're getting at different times of year. So some birds we're seeing a lot more of in the winter, for example. So we're seeing chiffchaff and blackcap are now an overwintering species. And in my lifetime, since I've been a bird watcher, these two species have been a wintering species. Not necessarily common, they are getting more common, but if I asked my dad, he would never have seen a chiffchaff or a blackcap in winter, or very, very rarely, probably because he wouldn't have known what they were. But the point remains, they just didn't do it. So now the UK is warm enough nearly all year round, which means that these two species can be in the UK all year round. So they feed a lot on insects, so particularly flies, and even in the winter we have more, there's winter gnats, or different insects can survive throughout the winter, which means there's the food for them. Also the fact that it's warmer, so they don't have to use as much energy to stay warm, which means that they don't need as much food. So that means that, yeah, they're staying all year round. That means that there's no need to migrate for the winter, so they save energy. So it's thought that some birds are becoming resident, some birds aren't migrating because these are traditionally both summer visitors. However, particularly in the case of the blackcap, it's also that new migration strategies are evolving because of these different conditions. So a few studies on blackcap have found that the blackcaps that we get in the winter are actually, all the ones that have been tested, are coming from the continent, mainly Germany. So rather than heading south in the autumn, they're actually heading west, which probably came about because of an accident, but then the bird survived, or the birds that did that survived because they could, because it was warm enough. And then they just kept doing it because they had that then imprinted, and then the birds keep doing it. And it's just fascinating to see this evolution of migration, to see it happening in real life. So it's an interesting one. You may not have blackcaps in your garden yet in the winter, particularly if you're in the north, but if you sit tight and if you keep an eye out over the next few years, it's likely that you will start seeing them. So yeah, do keep an eye out for those. We also have a few absent migrants as well. So there are several migrant species that we are not seeing as many of in the winter now compared to what we used to. And there's a few reasons for that. So the occurrence of winter short stopping and short staying are two things which have come about because of climate change. So short stopping is when birds stop short of their traditional wintering grounds. So for example, this is a Buick swan, and they breed in Arctic Russia, and they traditionally come to the UK to winter. Now, because it's warmer further kind of north and further east, they don't have to come that far. Remember, as I was saying, birds come here because they don't have to come that far, but they still don't have to come even this far, so they're just not. So why would they? Why would they expend that energy? But also some are short staying, so that means if they are still coming here, but they're not staying for as long, because I guess they just don't need to. Maybe it's going to start getting, like, spring is advancing in their breeding ground, so they can get back early, or something along those lines. So for Buick swans, we now have much, much fewer birds reaching the UK. Now, it's thought that this is also paired with population declines, like globally, likely to do with habitat loss and issues with shooting and lead poisoning. But all of these things are combining and affecting the UK populations. So this is also why it's really important to, when monitoring migration, monitoring it on a global scale to get the whole picture and see what's happening. Speaking about monitoring migration, we're going to go into that a little bit more now and have a think about some ways in which people do study this and how we know all of this amazing information. So, how do we know that birds migrate and where they go and the timings? Well, this is just a few examples. So, firstly, BirdTrack is a BTO survey that you can contribute to if you want to. It's a non-structured survey, so essentially that means you can record wherever and whenever you want to. And you can go around and you can record lists of everything you've seen. You can also, if you want, just add a quick record of a single species. And this also, a new addition, is being able to record dead birds or sick birds, which in the current bird flu situation, that outbreak, is really important as well, to submit this information. Now, when people go out and they're doing their BirdTrack lists and they record, for example, that they've seen their first swallow or their first chiffchaff, or yesterday there was one chiffchaff and now there's 15. All of that information helps build a picture about what the birds are doing. And that's great as well, because all it means is you're looking at the birds. So it doesn't mean the birds aren't having to do anything either. So it is an amazing, accessible way for you to get involved. Another project that the BTO are involved in is the bird ringing scheme. Now, this is probably, when people think about bird migration, it's probably one of the more familiar ones that people will think of. So this is where you put a metal or especially licensed bird ringers, put metal rings on birds' legs which have a unique code on, and that means that when someone else finds that bird, or if they themselves retrap that bird, they can get information about how long that bird lives, if the bird has actually died, how did it die, even information about what time of the year they're breeding, because you can look at them and you can see signs of breeding, what time they're molting, how many chicks they're having, if you then tie that in with nest recording. And this is really, really valuable information. In fact, it's thanks to bird ringing that we know that swallows migrate to Africa, because before bird ringing, people didn't know that. They had no idea. And someone put a ring on a swallow, and then someone in Africa found it and wrote a letter back to them because it had an address on it. And now we know. And that has completely revolutionized the way that we think about our birds. And yeah, it's a really, really important project. People also use things such as like radar to record birds. So you can use radar, much like people do your classic, like you see submarines. It works in the same way. So people will use radar to record what's flying over at night, or well, all the time. And from that, they can pick up information on the number of birds and even try and work out what type of bird it is. It's that advanced now that they can do that. And one final example is the tracking. Now, the British Trust for Ornithology are heavily involved in a lot of tracking projects. So a classic example is our cuckoo tracking project, where we put tags on cuckoos. And this can tell us information about the routes that they are taking, where they're wintering, and then when they're coming back. And there's different ways you can do this. You can put a tag on the bird, and you can then go out and have to find the bird yourself. You can put a little logger on, which means that you have to re-catch the bird, but that will record the photo period. And from that, you can work out where the bird's gone. So for example, the black-cap work, that is how they found out a lot of that information. And also things like the cuckoos, where it can tell you in real time almost where the bird is, which is amazing. So yes, this is probably the most fine scale that we've got at the minute in terms of recording migration, is actually looking at the individual level, at where birds are going. And that's really important, because that then can help tell us about how we can then best help them, and if we need to help them. So that's very useful. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the BTO cuckoos now. Cuckoos themselves are red listed. So this means that they are a bird of conservation concern and they have declined. So cuckoos migrate to West Africa, and the BTO has been satellite tracking them since 2011. So we need to know where they go in order to understand why they're declining. So they're red listed, they've massively declined, but it's not just in the UK, because we can do whatever we want in the UK. But if there's issues elsewhere on their route, we need to be able to know that, and in order to help them. So by tracking these cuckoos, we can see where they go, and we can identify those problems. So as you can see, they're wintering here in West Africa, and quite a lot of them, even though some of them go different routes across the Sahara Desert, they're still going to roughly the same place, which is amazing. The fact that different birds will still end up in the same place despite going different ways. There's also an amazing example. So PJ the cuckoo, which unfortunately has now died, but he was tagged in 2016 in Suffolk, and in, I think, 2022, he did his 6th journey. So he'd done at least 5 of these journeys, kind of to West Africa and back in his lifetime, which means that he travelled over 50,000 miles to and from his breeding grounds in the King's Forest in Suffolk. 50,000 miles. That's a long way. Yeah, my brain can't even comprehend that. So yeah, good old PJ, sadly not with us, but the cuckoo tracking project does continue. So if you would like to find out more about this, you can find out more information on the BTO website, and you can see, as you can see here, you can look at the updated map and see where they are and see if they're on their way to us. Global flyways, as the cuckoos is an amazing example of, global flyways are also really important to think about. So birds move along these major routes called flyways, and birds connect us through these. So they face many threats along the way. So in order to be able to protect them the best we can, we have to think globally and we have to coordinate our conservation methods, and also we have to work together as well. So make sure we're all working on the same page. So it's important for conservation because they can be affected by things all along their route. So this flyaway wide management is really important to help combat things such as threats. For example, hunting in the Mediterranean, but a lot of birds are getting hunted. So being able to understand what birds are going where, and then we can work out what the issues are in those places and then combat that. Really, really important. So now we're going to think a little bit about what birds you can start thinking about. So I'm recording this in spring. So now we're going to talk about some new spring arrivals and what we can expect to see over the next few weeks. So I'm going to start off by talking about the hirundines and swifts. So hirundines is a group including swallow, house martin, and sand martin. So if we start off with the swallow, this is the barn swallow. You may see it referred to in some books because there are other species of swallow in the UK, but not in the UK, so occasionally in the UK, but in Europe, for example, red rump swallow. But the purposes of this, it is the swallow. Now, the main features on the swallow are this red throat. It's got a very shiny blue back that extends all the way along its back. And it's got very, very long forked tail streamers, as we can see here, very, very long. Now, if we have a think about when you can see them, when you can expect to see them arriving, it's usually around April or May. I think this year, so this is 2023, I think some birds did arrive in late March. But yes, generally April and May is when you can expect your first swallows. Then we've got the sand martin. So the distinguishing features with the sand martin is that if we think about its underside, it has this white throat with a brown collar or neck band. So when you see this in flight, it is very, very obvious. Also on their back, they've got a dusty brown sort of colour, and their tail is quite short. Compared to the swallow, it is still forked, but it's very, very short. So sand martins nest in sand banks in these you get a colony of them, so you'll get a lot of birds in one place, and they make burrows in the bank. So you can kind of think sand martin is like sandy brown on its back, as opposed to that nice glossy blue of a swallow. They're normally the first of our hirundines to arrive, and they tend to turn up starting in March, so they should be well here by now. Then we have the last of our hirundines before we move to the swift. This is the house martin. Now, they also have a white throat, but they don't have that collar. They have white and they're clean all the way on their underside. So they're lovely and clean compared to that collar of the sand martin. They also have a shiny blue back, but notice that it's interrupted by this white rump. This white rump is really, really obvious even from a distance. So when you look at them, when they're banking, then they're turning and you can see their back, have a look for that. And they tend to arrive kind of March and April time. So yes, do keep an eye out for them. Now the swift. I'm just going to play this sound for you. Hopefully you can hear it. Now this is one of the classic sounds of summer. Whenever I hear my first one, or in the first few weeks of having them here, they're only around for about 100 days in the summer. I just am constantly looking up and I get bad neck. Should call it like bird neck or something. But let's have a listen. So that was the amazing sound of the swift, and I cannot wait to hear my first ones of the year. So swifts, if to look at them, they are dark overall, even on their underside, but they do have a pale throat. Now, most of the time, they are going to be flying extremely fast. So you may not be able to see that pale throat, but it is there. They have these long scythe-like wings and an arrow. They're kind of like an arrowhead shape. And in the evening, you get screaming parties. So that's when you hear that screaming sound of them all flying around as they're going up. And one of the amazing things about swifts is that they will, once they fledge, they will not touch land again until they first breed. So they just fly around for ages. And even when they go to roost, so they're not landing, where do they go? They sleep on the wing. So these screaming parties are them all getting together, and then it's thought that they go really, really high up in the sky. I guess that's maybe so that there's nothing in the way. But yeah, they go really, really high up in the sky, and then yeah, then they just fall asleep on the wing. They put half of their brain to sleep and the other half's flying around. It's amazing. And you can expect to see them from late April. So hopefully anytime from now you will be seeing your swifts. So fingers crossed. Now, I said about swifts not landing until they first come to breed. So if they do land, they are a bit scuppered. They can't get up from the ground. So if you do see a swift, the advice if you see a swift grounded, the advice is to try and release it from a high area. Even just lift your hand up, stand up, your hand up. Obviously, make sure it's not injured because you don't want to be dropping an injured swift out your window. But yes. So in order to make sure that they do not flop and they fly and continue to fly for the next 3 to 5 years non-stop, what they do is little press-ups. So as you can see here, this swift is doing press-ups. This is a young swift in the nest, and it's just doing press-ups to build up those muscles, it's thought, so that when it does eventually fly, it is yeah, it's doing good. So Swift doing press ups. I bet you never I bet you'd never even thought of that. I hadn't until until Faye mentioned it to me. It's amazing. Okay. Now we're going to have a think about some other spring arrivals. So we're going to think about some warblers. Now we've already met the chiffchaff at the bottom here, but we also have the very, very similar willow warbler, and I'm going to give you some tips to help you identify them. So the willow warbler to begin with has a very descending song, so I'll play that for you now. So I think that kind of the way I remember it is obviously it's very descending, but it's quite uncertain, almost like it doesn't know what it's going to say next. And I kind of think of it a bit like a falling willow leaf, falling out of a tree, and it's just fluttering down. You don't really know where it's going to go. Yeah, an amazing, amazing sound. The chiff-chaff, in contrast, a feature that you can use when you're looking at it is behaviorally, it bobs its tail a lot. It will flick its tail, whereas willow warblers don't tend to do that. And they sing their name. They go chiff chaff, chiff chaff. So I'll play this for you. So yeah, very, very different. The willow warbler, that kind of more descending, woo, whereas the chiff chaff is just two notes going chiff chaff, chiff chaff, chiff chaff. So hopefully, if you hear them singing, then yeah, that'll give the game away. They do also have slightly different calls, so I'd encourage you to go away and have a listen as well. It's mainly that willow warbler has a two-note call, so it goes doo, whereas a chiff chaff goes doo. Chiff chaff's one word, willow warbler's two words, if that helps. Both of these are in the group Veloscopus warblers, and that means leaf warblers. And when you see them in the tree, you can kind of see why, because they do look like leaves, and they're right out on the edge of the branches, so they are where the leaves are. So yeah, they're good fun to watch. Another way that you can identify them by looking at them is by looking at their primary projection. Now, you may hear people use this term. So what does that actually mean? Well, that essentially means kind of how far does the wing stick out beyond the tertial. So the tertial is these three feathers on the inner wing of the flight feathers. So there's three tertial feathers, and then how far in relation do the primary feathers, the flight feathers, stick out? So the primary feathers are the feathers on the outside of the wing. And on a willow warbler, it's much longer winged, and it's kind of almost a 1-to-1 ratio. They almost stick out as far as the tertials are long. Whereas the chiffchaff, it's about half the length of the tertials that it sticks out. And willow warblers have a much longer wing because they have to fly further. So they fly to sub-Saharan Africa, whereas chiffchaffs don't fly as far, so they don't need as long a wing. A few more warblers then. So firstly, the garden warbler. Now that has a really silly birder joke in that the Latin name is Sylvia boring, and people say that they are boring, Sylvia boring, because it's one of those where there's not actually a lot to go on. I've been caught out by these before. You're looking at it and you're like, oh, it's a warbler, I think. I don't know what it is. Oh, I don't know what to pick up on. And the thing is, there aren't many features to pick up on. That is their thing. So if you see a quite featureless warbler, then it might be a garden warbler. It's about the same size as a sparrow, and yeah, it's in terms of proportions, it's similar-ish to a blackcap, which we'll meet now. So another type of Sylvia warbler is a blackcap. The males have a black cap like this one in the photo, and then females have a brown cap, or juveniles as well also have a brown cap. So if you see a bird like this, but it's got a brown cap, then it's a female or a juvenile. Now, Sylvia warblers, kind of, yeah, your classic warbler shape, but they have, yeah, their forehead is kind of it's fairly smooth, but yeah, the proportions are similar for these two because they're quite closely related. Now, moving on to some different types of birds, we're going to start off with the wheatear. So wheatear is one of my favorite migrant birds. They are absolutely stunning, particularly in the spring when the males are turning up and they're all in their glad rags. They look really smart, like this one, with that like really striking supercilium and that really dark eye stripe and dark wings. And yeah, they're just really nice. Now, wheatears have a white rump, which give them their name. So if you think about it, it's a white rear. So they have this black sort of T shape and a plain back. So if we have a look here, as you can see, that is that white rump. So this is a male, and then I think this is either a female or a juvenile. And that white rump, when they fly away, very, very distinctive. If you see that, have a look, and it's most likely to be a wheatear. You might even just glance at it for a second, and you can quite often tell. And then, yes, as I say, this kind of black upside down T, and then plain back is important to compare it to our next bird, which is the whinchat. So a whinchat is a chat related to the stonechat as well, which you may have heard of. And whinchat have a dark rump and a streaky back. Here's a photo. So when they fly, they don't have that white rump, and their back is very, very streaky in comparison to the wheatear. So that's something to bear in mind. I think also they're slightly smaller as well, so the proportions are a bit different. Wheatear in particular as well do this thing where they'll stand on like a rock or something, and there'll be like a little meerkat impression. Be looking around and looking really upright. So that's another way you can tell. Now we're going to think a bit about migration and us, so our relationship as humans with bird migration. So spring bringers bring joy, but a lot of them need our help. Sadly, a lot of them are declining, which is really, really sad thinking about the connection that we've had with them throughout our history. So when people didn't have, I guess they like calendars and such. You couldn't just print off your calendar. They would have had an idea of what time of year it was, but when they saw, for example, their first swallow, they would have known that the seasons were going to start getting better, and the lights were going to start drawing out, and all of those sorts of things. Really, really special to us. We have a few almost forgotten spring bringers that we wanted to mention. So in making this presentation, I put a thing out on Twitter just asking people what their forgotten spring bringers were. So by this we mean not birds we've necessarily forgotten, but birds that used to be really, really common and now they don't see or hear them very often. And a very, very big one that came up was the nightingale. So nightingale, I have only heard, I think, 3 times in my life, and that's actually going to a particular spot that I knew they were going to be there, because they're not very common out and about when they used to be very, very common. So between 1995 and 2008, so that's 13 years, they declined by 53%. So we lost over half of our nightingales in 13 years. No. Yeah, 13 years. That's just horrible, really. And in ancient times, these birds were said to be a bird of the spring, but also a bird of morning as well. They're renowned for their amazing song, which literally goes through you. It's so loud and it's so powerful. So if you ever get a chance to go and listen to these, then definitely do. Another spring bringer is the swallow. So they are classic spring bringers of the UK. They leave the UK in winter, and then they go to Africa for their spring. So swallows have an endless summer. And in ancient Greece, children would dress up as swallows and go round houses for trick or treat. So I guess like we would do Halloween, they would do it just as swallows for, I guess, to bring in spring, which is lovely. Another one, the cuckoo, as we've already spoken about. So we've just got a couple of lovely quotes about cuckoos. So the first one is, "When the cuckoo first calls in the leaves of the oak, we know it is March. And the merry cuckoo, messenger of spring." And these just really kind of bring home how people almost rely on the cuckoo as that signal that, oh, like the other day someone asked me, "Oh, have you heard your first cuckoo yet?" And that kind of tells a lot of people, yes, it's spring. So it is a very, very important one to us. But we've lost, I think in 1980s, 65% were lost. And the shift in the timings of breeding between the cuckoos and their hosts. So as we've spoken about with phenological mismatch, the birds are arriving at different times, but that means that if their hosts are migratory, for example, dunnocks or meadow pipits, they might have adjusted their breeding timings differently to the cuckoo adjusting its time of migration. So by the time it arrives, they might either have chicks or eggs, but eggs that are too far on. So yes, that is massively affecting the cuckoo, because if they're arriving and they can't lay their eggs in other birds' nests because they've timed it wrong, or not that they've timed it wrong, but things are mismatched out of their control, then what are they meant to do? How are they meant to have young? Because they rely on other species. So it's a very good example of how everything is interconnected. Another forgotten spring bringer is the turtle dove. One I've never actually seen myself. And it was thought that if one pair died, the other was believed to mourn and perhaps never bond again with another bird. And that's what people used to think. And again, we have a lovely quote here. "The winter is past, the rain is over and gone, the flowers appear on the earth, the time of singing has come, and the voice of the turtle dove is heard in our land." So it's just saying how as the seasons are getting brighter, the flowers are appearing, and now we're going to start hearing the turtle doves because it's spring and it's getting into summer and everything is looking up. And it's not just in the UK that people have spring bringers. So another example in Europe is the white stork. So in Bulgaria, the stork is a symbol of the coming spring. Ancient Slavs believed that winter was death, and then storks were carrying the souls of the dead. They traveled south to paradise, so the storks were taking the souls of the dead to paradise as they migrated in the winter or in the autumn to their wintering grounds. And storks would return with spring, a complete cycle of reincarnation. So, yes, in a lot of aspects of life, it is really, really important to humans. So I have a final recap now, just to go over what we've learned and with a couple of little quizzes. So I'm going to play some sounds to you. Firstly, I'd like you to have a look at these birds and have a think, what do you think they are? So you can note them down to yourselves. And then I'm going to play these sounds. So feel free to pause the video if you want to. Okay, so each of those sounds does relate to the birds. We didn't necessarily hear all of those sounds, but hopefully it gave you a clue. The photo gave you a clue. So this first bird on the left is a winchat. So remember, it's got that streaky back. Bird in the middle is a swift. So it's all dark and it's got those long scythe-shaped wings. And the bird on the right is a swallow. So it's got that kind of, you can almost see the red throat. It has got that glossy blue back, but the main thing here is you can see those tail streamers, which are very, very distinctive. Okay, another one then before we go on to some challenges. So again, the sounds should hopefully help you, but we may not have necessarily heard them. So use all the clues you have. Okay, so the bird on the top left here is a chiffchaff. So it can be quite tricky to see. It has got fairly short wings, but the giveaway is that it's the sound it's making is singing chiff chaff, chiff chaff, chiff chaff. And then the black cap is the other bird. So as we can see, it's a nice male. It has its black cap. And the song that it's doing there, we didn't hear it earlier, but it's got this quite scratchy sort of tone to it. And it starts off quite quiet and then it gets quite loud. And it does them in fairly short sections, but it keeps repeating it. In contrast, the garden warbler, if you do hear one of those, or if you look up what it sounds like after this, you will hear that it will just keep going on and on and on and on. So that could be quite a good feature for the garden warbler. Okay, so that nearly brings us to the end of this session. So we just got a few challenges if you want to keep on and develop your learning after this session. So to begin with, we would encourage you to go cuckoo and check out the BTO cuckoos and how they are getting on the BTO website. So as I say this, I think one of them is on its way in France. A few of them are in Spain. So do check that out whatever time you have a look at this recording. Another one we would like to encourage you to do is to get outside. So it's a great time of year to go and visit the same spot twice. And if you go to the same place twice, maybe a few days or a week or a couple of weeks apart, hopefully you will notice that the birds you are seeing and hearing are different. Maybe there's new arrivals on the second time. Maybe some birds have just started singing or aren't singing now because they're down on eggs. So yeah, definitely get out and find somewhere to go and have a little look around and yeah, see what you can see and hear. And if you can spot any of those spring bringers that we have met today. Just a reminder before we finish, if you're interested, the BTO runs an exciting equipment donation scheme, which if you're a young person, hopefully you can benefit from. And if you are an older person, then you might be interested in donating equipment that you have if you're not eligible to be able to apply for this yourself. So essentially what this means is that people can donate unused equipment or equipment that they do not need that has previously been used for young people to be able to use, which can help. We just want to break down that barrier because equipment can be very, very costly. So anything people can donate is very, very much appreciated. And hopefully it can help you young people get out there and enjoy the birds and make the most out of the natural world. The final thing is to ask you, if you don't already, to check us out on social media. So on Twitter, we're @_BTO, British Trust for Ornithology on Facebook, and then @BTO Birds, all lowercase, on Instagram. And if you'd like to find out more about BTO Youth, then please check out our website. And if you have any questions, feel free to email us. And that brings us to the end of the session. So all that's left to say is thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks very much. Bye.